Hello and welcome to part 3 in our series on Azure Enterprise Integration Development. Today we're going to be talking about Visual Studio and the different integration project types. My name is Dan Probert and I'm the Chief Technical Officer at ASPNET. You can find me on Twitter at ProbertDaniel and I have a blog at www.bizbert.com. As we've covered in the earlier videos, we've aimed this series at developers, testers, operations and support staff, technical managers, architects and designers, and anyone else with a bit of technical knowledge or curiosity. There's 12 videos in total in this series. This is part 3. Each of the videos is around about 20 minutes long and is also accompanied by a blog post that covers the same content that's in the video. You can find a link to the previous videos and also to the blog posts in the description for this video. At the very end, when we've released all 12 videos and the accompanying blog posts, we'll also release a document that contains all the content in the series that you can download and use for yourself. Right, let's talk a little bit about Visual Studio development. So Azure gives us some new choices as developers. We don't have to rely on Visual Studio or the integration development environment anymore for doing our development. We have other choices now. For example, some of the Azure technologies we can develop in the portal in our browser. So the Logic Apps Designer and Functions are two examples of technologies that we can develop in the browser. Having said that, most enterprises will probably still prefer to use Visual Studio. And there's a number of reasons for this. It complements the existing development practices they have, especially if they're doing integration development today. For example, BizTalk, they'll be very used to using Visual Studio. The developers will know it, and they'll have a lot of practices and processes set up around using it. It's also familiar to most integration developers who have been using it for quite a few years. It allows them to do source control directly with, say, Visual Studio Team Services, and with the wide number of plugins that a lot of developers have today, they'll be used to using those to help develop their code. It also reduces extra training time because you don't have to train developers up in a new development environment. Let's talk about some of the Visual Studio project types we'll be using. So, although there are many project types in Visual Studio, only a handful of them are useful for the types of projects we use in Azure. We'll go through some of them here. The ASP.NET Web Application is a project type that we use for developing web apps, and mobile apps and API apps and deploying those into Azure. An API app, as mentioned, is a specific type of ASP.NET Web Application, but it's automatically given a REST interface. Azure Functions are technically also a type of ASP.NET Web Application, although within Visual Studio and also in Azure, they're a type of web job. Azure Resource Group is probably the most flexible project type, and it covers everything else. So Logic Apps, storage accounts, service bus namespaces, API connections, all those are defined within an Azure Resource Group. And then we have a new project type known as an integration project. This is where we can create our schemas and our maps or transforms that we want to use with integration accounts in Logic Apps. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these one by one, and then I'll take you through Visual Studio and show you the different options you have. So the ASP.NET Web Application. As mentioned, this covers all the app service types, the Azure App Services, so web apps, API apps, mobile apps. Function apps are technically also part of App Service, but function apps today have their own project type, which we'll cover next. You can use the project to create the app service and app service plan as well as the actual app that's being deployed. However, and I'll show you this in our demo, when you use Visual Studio to create your app service and your app service plan, unless you explicitly ask it to, it's not going to create an ARM template, which means that when you come to check in your code and then say use VSTS to do a deployment, VSTS doesn't have anything to deploy. It can't create an app service and an app service plan. So our recommendation is that you create a separate ARM template to define the app service and the app service plan. And we're going to cover this in greater detail in the next video in the series where we talk about deployment from Visual Studio. So the Visual Studio project that we create, the ASP.NET Web Application, represents the code in the app. But I feel like I'm labouring the point here, but it doesn't represent the app service or the app service plan. The app service is equivalent to the application in IIS. So if you're used to creating, say, an ASP.NET application or a WCF service, in IIS you would create an application, and then you would set the directory for that application for where your code's located. So the Visual Studio project is the code, the app service is the application in IIS, and the app service plan is the server farm. So it defines how many servers your app service is going to be running on. Let's show you an example of how this works. So if I come into Visual Studio here, and I say I want to add a new project, and I'm going to be going to the cloud option, which is where we find most of our integration projects, and I'm going to choose ASP.NET Web Application, and I'll give it a name, and it's going to ask me what type of ASP.NET application. So here what we're interested in is that we could do an API app, a mobile app, or we could do web forms or MVC. Both web forms and MVC are types of web apps. The API app template here, which we're going to cover next, will create a REST interface. So we're going to go, say, with web forms here. Now we have an option down here that says, do we want to host it in the cloud? If we say yes, it will automatically pop up with a dialog that lets us create or specify an existing app service and app service plan. I'll show you that in a second, but for now we'll untick that. And one thing that's usually useful to do is add unit tests as well. So we go OK, and it's going to create us a new ASP.NET application. Now what's slightly different here is that this application is not designed to run on IIS locally. It's specifically designed to run up in Azure. And when we build it, although we will be generating some assemblies that can be used for deployment, it won't automatically deploy it up into Azure for us. If we come into here and we want to deploy this up into Azure, we'd be coming up and doing publish. And when we do that, we'll ask how we want to publish it. Okay? And if we choose App Service, it's going to ask us to go away and choose a subscription, a resource group, and then it's going to ask us for either an existing app service, or it's going to give us the option for creating a new one. So in this case here, if I say, well, we'll create a new app service, it's going to ask for a name for the app, for the web app, and it's going to use that also as the name of the app service, the subscription, the resource group it's in, the service plan type, and letting us create a new one. But down here we have an option to export. Now if we export this, it'll generate an ARM template that we can save somewhere. I'm going to cover this in the next video because you can use this to auto-generate an ARM template that creates your app service. But for now, our recommendation is that you can deploy your web app to your own local subscription if you want, but you still need to create some sort of deployment code that VSTS can use for automated deployment. Right, so this here is the project type ASP.NET Web Application for a web app. We can also create API apps as well, which basically just gives us a REST interface on top of a normal web app. So it's similar in thinking to an old WCF app using SOAP and WSDL. In this case here we're using REST, JSON and Swagger. So as mentioned before, an API app is one of the types of ASP.NET Web Application templates. It's going to create an MVC based REST API by default. It's very easy to add new operations. It's actually done via configuration. It looks at the function names, the method names we've got, and automatically creates, or by default, automatically creates operations from those. And it's also easy to unit test. We can auto-generate some of the unit tests as well. So as before with a web app, we can also create the app service and app service plan from the publish dialog. And again, that's useful for developer testing, but you're going to want to have an ARM template that VSTS can use to do that as well. So yes, it's better to create a separate ARM template. So let's look at one of those. In the same solution here, I can come in and I can add a new project, and it's again going to be an ASP.NET Web Application, and I'll call that demos.eid.api app. In this case here, I'm going to choose Azure API app, and I'm not going to host it in the cloud, but I will add some unit tests to it. As mentioned before, when you choose the option to host it in the cloud, all that does is bring up the publish dialog for you straight away. So now it is adding the new application, or new project. Now the project is very, very similar to the web app one we created earlier. The only main difference in here is we go to controllers. This is all the sample code, and it's generated a number of different HTTP method operations. So we can get values, we can get a specific value by ID, we can post values, put values, and delete values. But again, all this is handled automatically just by having a method in here that has the name get, and then some parameters being passed in. This is one of the benefits of using the REST, or the Web API framework in Visual Studio. It's very, very easy to support different types of HTTP methods. But again, this project on its own, you can't deploy automatically from VSTS. VSTS would still need to know how to create the app service and the app service plan. So again, you'll need an ARM template for that, and we will cover that in the next video. Azure Functions. Now Azure Functions are still in preview for Visual Studio, so the project type might change. One of the important things about Azure Functions is that behind the scenes they're just a type of web job, which means that technically they're another type of ASP.NET application, although that's pretty well hidden from you. And another thing to bear in mind, although you can publish functions from Visual Studio today, if you do that, there's a bug, which means that your logic apps can't see the created function app. So you actually have to create the function app up in the Azure portal first, and then deploy your functions to that new created function app. If you try and deploy it from Visual Studio or create the function app in Visual Studio, then logic apps can't see it. Again, this is another good reason that you should have an ARM template that creates your function apps for you. So a function app is an app service app. The Visual Studio project represents the actual function app, and then you have multiple functions inside the function app. One of the differences with function apps is that it supports a new type of app service plan. Normally the app service plans are pay monthly plans. You set a size, T1, S1, something like that, and that dictates how many servers it's going to run on, and how many transactions a second it can process, and how much memory will be available. But with function apps, you have a different type of plan available, which is a dynamic plan, so consumption-based billing. You pay for the functions as you execute them. Let's have a look at a function project type. We add a new project and we choose Azure Functions. So in this case here, I'll name it again. And it will go away and create a new function app. Now, the function app has nothing in it yet. It has no functions. As I said before, this represents the function app in Azure. And although you can right click and go publish, and it will say where do you want to publish to, and you can choose Azure App Service, and just like we did with our API app or our web app, we can choose an existing or a new function app to deploy to. If you do that, your logic app will not be able to see the function app. So it's best that you don't do it this way. To add new functions to our function app project, we right click and we go add new Azure function. And here we get to select the type of function. So this is effectively a template here. So we're selecting both the language that we're using, so C# or Node.js JavaScript, or F# or PHP, and then the type of trigger. Now, if you're using functions with logic apps, you have to choose a webhook trigger. So if you're a C# developer, you choose generic webhook here. And if you're a Node.js developer, you would choose the equivalent down here under JavaScript, generic webhook node. In our case, we'll stay with the C# one. And let's say, for example, we called this converts customer reference. It goes away and it creates a new function prototype for us. And our code sits in this file over here, the run.csx file. And we get some sample code in here. This is the equivalent to a C# file. Now, the functions project is still in preview. They're still adding a lot of new functionality to the to function apps. And some of that functionality includes the ability now to have your code inside an assembly. So instead of having to have the source code here, we might have either an existing assembly we're using, or we've created a new assembly that has many classes in it, or many methods. And each one of those methods might be exposed as a different function. That hasn't yet made its way into the Visual Studio project type. So chances are this will have changed, maybe by the time you're watching this video. But for a webhook, we have a standardized signature here in terms of how it's called, and then we are expecting our payload to be passed in as JSON, and then we're returning a response back out again. One of the cool things about functions is that it's very, very easy to reference NuGet packages. Under dependencies in here, we can add a reference to a NuGet package, and it will automatically go away to NuGet and download the package and add a reference to it. So that's a function project type. Each folder in here represents a separate function. Azure Resource Group. This is probably the most versatile project because it contains almost everything else. So, as I said, it's the workhorse of the integration project types. An Azure Resource Group is effectively a container for an ARM template, or at least one ARM template, plus the script to execute the ARM templates. When you create one, when you create an Azure Resource Group project type, you can choose from a number of standardized templates or a blank ARM template. It also allows us to create a logic app. And in fact, the logic app template will allow us to use the logic apps designer. It's the only ARM template, it's the only template type in the Resource Group project that has its own built-in designer. And then we can use the project to deploy a single ARM template to Azure. Let's show you creating one of those projects. So we add a new project, we choose Azure Resource Group, and then in this case, let's assume it's going to be a storage account. Now we're going to cover this in a later video, but our recommendation is that you have a different project for each of the type of resources you're creating. So in this case here, our project storage account is, or storage accounts I should say, is where we store all the storage accounts we're using for our application. Now there are a number of templates you can select here. You'll see Logic App is one of the template types we can select. Most of them though are not that useful for integration. They're very useful for things like IaaS and creating virtual machines. There is actually a storage template here that we could use, but you can also choose templates from other places. So the quick start examples, for example, are up on GitHub. Generally what I do is I create a blank template. What that will do is we'll end up with 3 files in our project. We've got the actual ARM template here. It's an empty ARM template. We've got the parameters file. Remember we talked about this in the previous video. So this allows us to pass in parameters to our ARM template. And then we've got a PowerShell file here called deploy Azure resource group. What that will do is this PowerShell file will create the resource group and then will deploy the ARM template for us. If you remember in last week's video we talked about how we deploy an ARM template, and we do that by calling this PowerShell commandlet here, new Azure RM resource group deployment. This PowerShell script is actually used by Visual Studio. If I right click and I say deploy, what's going to happen when it executes is it's going to call this PowerShell script. So Visual Studio knows what parameters are expected. So for that reason, you need to be very careful if you decide to edit this PowerShell script. Because if you remove any of the parameters or change how they work, then you won't be able to deploy from Visual Studio. What's interesting though is that Visual Studio Team Services doesn't use this PowerShell script. It's only used for local deployment. And again, we will cover this in our next video when we talk about deployment. You can have multiple Azure templates in here, and you can have multiple parameters files. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a later video, and we talk about how we manage our parameter files and how we create naming standards for everything. Because if you've got a lot of ARM templates, you're going to end up with a large number of files in here, and they can be difficult to manage. Earlier versions of this project type used to put the ARM template and the parameter files in a templates folder, but they've now moved it up to the root. There's also a bug in deployment, and we will cover this next week, but if you've got multiple resource group project types and you create a new deployment just covers the subscription you're deploying to, the resource group, the template you want to deploy, and which parameter file you're using. So you can have multiple parameter files. The idea is that you would have one parameter file per environment generally, so you'd have a developer one and a test one and an acceptance parameter file. The bug is that if you've got multiple of these resource group projects and you've already set up a deployment for a previous project, it can get a little bit stuck, and when you right click and deploy, it doesn't show you the templates that are in your current project. It only lets you select templates that are in a previous project, and then you have to go away and create a whole new deployment. So that there shows you a sample of the resource group project when we were creating something like a storage account. Now, editing these files we're going to cover in a later video, but there is actually a JSON outline here that lets us see what's being put into here. It gives us sort of a tree view over what we're creating. And when we covered the ARM templates last week, we went through what all the different types of content you have in an ARM template are. So we won't be covering that here. What I will do though is show you what happens when we create a Logic App template. So I can create a new project, and again it's an Azure Resource Group project. In this case here I'll call it Logic Apps, and I'm going to choose the Logic App template. Oops, there we go. Now again the project's going to look very similar. We've again got the deployment script and 2 files, an ARM template and a parameters file. The only difference is that the ARM template now has more data in it, okay? So it's got a couple of parameters, Logic App name and its location. And if we come down to resources, it's creating a resource with the provider type of Microsoft.Logic workflows. Now it's put this in, it's a hook so the designer can find it. Because now if I right click here on our ARM template, I'll get an option. An option to open the Logic App Designer here. This only applies to ARM templates that have this resource type here of Microsoft.logic/workflows. And the first time we want to open with the Logic App Designer after we've opened Visual Studio, it's going to prompt us to connect to a subscription and a resource group. And the reason it does that is that the designer needs to know where to find things like API connections and integration accounts. And in order to do that, it needs to be connected to a subscription and resource group. So if we do that and we choose say for example, we choose a new resource group here, or an existing resource group, it'll go away and the Logic App Designer will open, and it's almost the same as the Logic App Designer that's in the portal. That's usually a few versions behind. So here we go, here's the standard Logic App Designer with the lovely video from Jeff. Hey Jeff. And you can choose a template here if you want to, or you can just start with a blank Logic App. What's interesting is that if you start creating a Logic App, say for example I come in here and I create a Logic App with a single request, and then I put in a single response. I save the Logic App. If I go to Code View, I will see the definition for the Logic App. What's interesting though is that that is just part of the ARM template. If I actually come out of the designer completely and I open up the Logic App just in the normal editor, you'll see that the full ARM template here, the Logic App definition is just a small part of this. The Logic App definition is actually starts here under definition and just runs down till we get to the closed brace down here. So this is what you see in Code View, but it's only part of your complete ARM template. And it's important to know that, because if you use the Logic App Designer and it starts adding in things like integration accounts or API connections, it'll add them in further down inside your ARM template, but you won't see them in Code View. Now we'll cover this in a later video when we talk about parameterization of your Logic Apps. In order to be able to take your Logic Apps and deploy them automatically using Visual Studio Team Services Release Management, you're going to want to take some of the hard-coded values in your ARM template and parameterize them, either by declaring them as variables or adding in parameters that pass in extra details. So for example, if your integration account is in a different resource group, or in a different in a different resource group, for example, then you need to pass in the resource group name that it's located in. Now one of the annoying things with the resource group type project is if I want to add a new Logic App, you'd assume you could come in here and go add new item, but all you get is the ability to add a new default ARM template, basically an empty ARM template here, or an empty JSON file. And if you do that, it's not a Logic App. So you have a number of choices here. What I tend to do is the Logic App template that we get when we first add the Logic App, I store that separately and then I paste that in. I create a new ARM template and I paste that in. Or you could copy your existing Logic App here, copy the file and paste it. But you've got to be very careful, because you can end up then with another Logic App with the same name as your first Logic App, and when you deploy it, it's just going to overwrite your existing Logic App, which is not ideal. Right, so that's the Azure Resource Group project type. Yes, the last point I just covered now, which is that it's not easy to add another templated ARM template easily. You can add an empty ARM template, but not one that's got content in it. So for that reason, we recommend that you have a little library of ARM template samples, for example storage accounts or service bus namespaces. And again, we're going to cover that later, and our final documentation that we'll supply with this series will have all those samples in it as well for you to use. Right, the last project type we're going to cover today is the integration project type. So this represents an integration account. It allows for the addition of schemas and maps, so you can create schemas and you can create maps. It uses the BizTalk schema and map editor. It's the actual schema and map editor. If you go through the code that gets deployed when you deploy the integration account extension, you'll see it's actually using some BizTalk assemblies. It also includes the BizTalk flat file wizard, so if you want to create a flat file schema that you use with the flat file connectors in Logic Apps. But it doesn't today allow for the creation of the integration account or the upload of the schemas and maps. It'll let you create them, but you still then got to go to the portal today to upload your schemas and maps, and that will change in time. It's just the way it is today. It also doesn't support using folders, so you have to keep all your schemas and maps at the root level. So let's show you that project type. So in this case here, we're going to add a new project. We're going to choose Logic Apps, and here it's called Integration Account. And for our purposes, we're going to call this Integration. And it creates a new project type with nothing in it. We have to start adding content into it. But from here, if I close down these other windows so it's more clear, from here I can right click and I get some new options to add. So when I go add new item, I can only add 3 things. I can add a new flat file schema, and that's going to bring up the well-known and well-loved BizTalk flat file schema wizard. I can add new XML schema, and that will bring up the BizTalk schema editor, or a new map, and that will bring up the mapper. Notice that I can't add anything else. There's no support for adding any other item to these projects. So let's say, for example, I choose a schema. We'll call this order schema. And here we go. This is the BizTalk schema editor. So we just have a root node in here. Let's leave it like that, and you'll see here's the order schema here in the root of the project. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to add a new map. And notice that it's a standardized BizTalk mapping file. What's interesting about these maps is that Logic Apps doesn't understand the BTM format. It only understands XSLT format. So, and actually, one of the things, well, probably the main reason this project exists, beyond giving you the editors, is that when you build it, it compiles and generates an XSLT file. Now, this is not really a very real map here, because it's going from one schema type to the same schema type. And we'll just map that to seem to have found a bug here in the map. Oh no, there we go. It's worked. So now we have a BTM file, but we can't upload a BTM file to an integration account in the portal. It has to be an XSLT file. So if we build this, once it's finished building, if we go and look at the source code, or go and look at what's in the project folder, and we go to the bin folder, what we'll find in here, under debug, because we're currently running in debug mode, we find our XSLT, and this is what you need to upload to your integration account. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's no deploy option here. I can't come in here and go publish or deploy or anything like that. There's no way to create an integration account. And today, there's not full ARM support for integration accounts. Although you can create an integration account in an ARM template, if you want to upload your schemas and your maps, you actually have to embed the content as base64 encoded content inside your ARM template, which is not ideal. So in the next video in the series, we're going to cover how you can actually deploy from Visual Studio. And the way we do that is we create a separate deployment project with an ARM template and a special script in it that when you deploy, finds all your schemas and your maps and will create an integration account and deploy them for you. And then you can use the same code then from Visual Studio Team Services. So you then have an automated way of doing deployment of integration accounts and everything that's in them. Right, so that's integration accounts. And as I've said, one of the things we'll cover in the next video when we talk about deployment is that we suggest creating a separate resource group project with a custom script for deploying integration accounts. And as part of the documentation series, we'll give you a copy of that script as well that you can use for yourself. Right, if you want to know more about creating ARM templates for the resource groups, then there's some links here that you can follow. These are the same links that we had in our previous video on Azure resource groups. Right, that's the end of part 3. So the next video in this series is going to talk about Visual Studio build and deployment. So all the projects we had there, how do we deploy those from Visual Studio? What's the best way of doing that? And in some cases that will involve creating new project types. And that's the end of the video today. Thank you very much for watching.